He has engaged a significant number of people, and we are becoming a go-to of event for people who want to incite debate, which is the byline for the Fabians identity. And it was a great pleasure to put together this panel. In fact, it came together very, very quickly, very, very easily. It just took one email with 3 people being invited, and they all said yes. In the case of Sandra, I just think it was a generic email. It just said, to TUA, please send this on to Sandra, and boom, we got it. And so I'm very pleased to have it. It came about because of a conversation I had with David Parker somewhere near his esteemed retirement, and David said he still had a few conversations left in him. He still had an issue that he wanted to raise about democracy, and particularly about the conventions under which our parliamentary system works, and I'm very pleased to say that he's now going to deliver on some of those comments. But before we start, I'm very pleased to have Tatjana Buklijas here, who is from the Auckland University and who has an academic background in the issues that we're looking at, and I'll ask her to introduce the background and the perspective from which she comes. Tatjana.
Thanks. All right. So how do I, the slides? Okay, great. Okay. So thank you. So as I was introduced, my name is Tatjana Buklijas. I'm an academic at the University of Auckland, and I've been working in the area of deliberative democracy for the past 5-6 years. Next slide. Yeah. So I thought by just sort of starting with very general introduction on like what is democracy, and just a shout out to my. I don't know. Like this? Can you hear me? Better? Yeah? Okay. All right. Maybe a bit, yeah. Is it okay now? Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Hopefully it won't move. Right. So as I said, I would like to start with a very basic introduction into what we are talking about, what is democracy. And just a shout out to my colleague Matheson Russell, who pointed out this paper to me by American political theorist Wendy Brown. And she sort of very usefully warns us that democracy really just signifies a rule by the people, and its contrast with aristocracy, plutocracy, oligarchy, monarchy, and the condition of being colonized and condition of being occupied. And just looking at the etymological and historical origin, there is no argument that can be made that democracy actually entails either representation or constitution or liberalism or deliberation or really any of that stuff. Rather, it's just a political claim that people rule themselves, and that the whole rather than part or the other is the political sovereign. So that's kind of all there is. Next slide, please. So one thing that's quite striking, considering that I just said that democracy is kind of a bit of an empty container, and that the term doesn't tell us which powers should be shared with the people, how this rule of people should be organized, by which institutions, should there be any supplemental condition. It doesn't tell us any of that. And maybe paradoxically, precisely because it's so kind of unfinished and a bit empty, it's really quite popular. And I just put this graph from this Pew Research Center that shows us that actually democracy has never been more popular than it is today, right? Like when you look at the more regimes than ever are calling themselves democratic. Now, of course, when we look at the countries that call themselves democratic, we have Western countries that pack a lot into what they think democracy is, from being liberalist, like adherent to liberal ideology, to having constitutions, to practicing equality, hoping for a representation, to kind of very just idea we'll have elections. And, like everybody probably remembers here how Iraq was meant to become democratic by basically forcing elections on people. So yes, so kind of this is sort of where we are. Can we, next slide, please? Yeah, so we are in a kind of situation where democracy is super popular as a type of regime around the world, But at the same time, we all recognize that there are all these problems with the institution of democracy. I've kind of like tried to separate here from kind of big issues. Some of them are new or newish, like climate change, globalization, demographic changes. Some of them are sort of changes in economy and work. And some of them are exacerbated, sort of global inequality is not a new thing. Global political instability is just that we have all of these things happening at the same time. And democratic regimes are not coping with them very well. And part of the reason why they are not coping, or kind of we think, is because the institutions that we have developed so far are not working very well. So various aspects of democratic participations, like voter turnout, other kinds of democratic participation. I was just recently looking at a paper that is showing us response to surveys, right? Like, do people even respond? That has pretty much collapsed since the 1990s. So it's very hard to even understand what people think when nobody's actually picking up and filling the surveys. And of course, like collapse of political parties as participatory organizations, and of course, a resurgence of far-right nationalism and populism, including, which sort of brings challenges to democratic values and institutions. And this is why, some people, of course, have started to make claims, like, for example, James Lovelock, famous environmentalist, author of Gaia Hypothesis, that maybe actually democracy is not a good regime for current times, and maybe we should be looking for some kind of technocratic, authoritarian, kind of enlightened, wise technocratic autocrats who will be able to plan long-term rather than change every 3, 4, 5 years. Okay, so next slide. So some of us, I think many of us will disagree that actually the way to go is authoritarian regime, but it clearly needs to be some sort of change. And I guess the way that I understood this panel is that we will be addressing maybe 3 types of democratic institutions, and one way to change is to actually think about how we might reform representative democracy. And I think this is what David will be talking about a little bit, which could be around changes to the electoral system, transparency of political parties, securing elections. There's a whole lot of things, and I'm sure that many of you have thought about them. And the second, like, how do we reform participation and participatory democracy as a layer of democracy, which could be improving the inclusivity and access to all kinds of participatory institutions. From how we participate in town halls and decisions at local level, and boards of inquiry, and even like just getting kind of more input from people. And then also things like improving the information environment, really, which is a big challenge of our time. And finally, the sort of thing that I want to talk about for the rest of my time is this institutional innovation of deliberative democracy that has been proposed by a lot of democratic theorists as a kind of promising area of experimentation and innovation. Next slide. All right. Okay, so I think many of you will know a little bit or a lot about deliberative democracy, and I know that Fabians have had speakers to speak about, Max Rashbrook at least. I remember that he gave a talk on Wellington Citizens Assembly a year or two, and there may have been others. So, I mean, you have a kind of general idea what it is, but I guess kind of the basic idea of deliberative democracy that places reasoning, deliberation, and informed debate, and informed and inclusive debate among citizens at the center of democratic process. And I really like what Simone Chambers' political theorist, how she defined this, and how she contrasted representative and deliberative democracy, and said that we're talking these are like talk-centric and vote-centric. And in vote-centric, we understand the group preference as a sum of individual preferences, right? So it's a kind of prefixed already when people are going into decision making. While in deliberative democracy, we think that group preferences are formed in the act of deliberation as people find shared ground and consensus. So it's quite sort of different way of thinking how group decides. So the very idea of finding these group decisions through deliberation is old. And often you will find in literature that's placed to going back to kind of Athenian democracy in Greek times. Now there are political theorists who argue that it's actually even older, that it comes from Mesopotamia, that was brought by Phoenicians to Greece. Like, it's not actually that important, but we know that it's old and we know that it's global as an idea. And there are forms of deliberative decision-making everywhere around the world. For example, there's a principle of Panchayat Raj by Mahatma Gandhi. There are village sort of deliberative forms in India. There's just one kind of fascinating anecdote that I read recently about attitudes towards democracy in Africa and Mali, where a group of Dutch researchers studied attitudes towards democracy and found that there was a widespread aversion to representative democracy. But when they tried to kind of dig into why, they believed, Malians, that voting is inferior way of making decisions in a complex society, because in the old Sahelian regimes, the tradition was that if you kind of bring group to deliberate and everybody walks away with something, and if you vote and the majority wins, then you have winners and losers lose face, and there's always kind of bad feeling after that. So this sort of explains, and of course, like if we look closer to home, the Maori traditions of deliberative decision-making in Hui are, of course, much closer to this thinking of talk-centric approach. And so if you want to read, I won't kind of go very much into this, but some colleagues have mentioned Matike Mai process with dozens of Hui and Wananga as a kind of example of a sort of homemade deliberative process. Okay, maybe next slide. Right. But of course, when we talk about deliberative democracy today, we often we usually mean these new forms. We usually think about citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies and deliberative polls, these new forms that have emerged in Western countries since 1970s, and they theoretically build on this idea of communication and sort of reasoning in the public sphere that was in the work of German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And then of these experiments with these novel forms where diverse groups of citizens would come together to make decisions on a sort of various kinds of issues. And one thing that's often mentioned, and it's now become really part of canon of deliberative democracy, is sortition, as this two-step process where large groups of people are invited, and then from those people who are willing to participate, a sample that descriptively represents whatever population you are wanting to bring is then brought together into the deliberative rooms or to deliberate. And so this random selection being informed, supported in various ways to make deliberation more easier, supported by experts, by knowledge, given enough time. These are kind of the constitutive elements of deliberative processes that have been done today. Next slide. So when I started to work on the problem of, how could we introduce deliberative democracy or sort of experiment with deliberative democracy in Aotearoa, New Zealand, at first I thought that we actually had no tradition, which turned out to be wrong. So in this paper that I wrote with Simon Wright and Meg Strachbrook, we actually researched and we found that there has been experiments, and there was quite a serious experiment in 1996 in Wellington when a group of 12 people was brought to deliberate about the sale of shares in electrical company, the remaining 49% of the shares. And it was really well designed and ran process, which in the end the outcome was that decision of the citizens was not respected, and the mayor decided to do what he actually wanted to do anyway in the first place, which probably was a bad start for deliberative democracy. And then for the next about 20 years after that, there have been experiments, mostly at local level, almost all of them, except for the Bioethics Council, and which was at a body attached to the Ministry of Environment. But overall, there wasn't all that so there wasn't all that much going on. So I want to say there was something at local level, and for the most part, the decisions that the citizens made were not really implemented. Next slide. However, so in the so really, I kind of think that that in 2020, when my colleagues and I and Bartley is here, when we got a research grant that allows us to actually start exploring and experimenting with formats of deliberative democracy, we were probably lucky because it was possibly a good time to do it. We probably had a political environment that was perhaps more permissive towards these kinds of experiments. The other thing was, some of the projects that we did was on the right-hand side. It's a project that we did with water care about the next source of water for Auckland. On the left-hand side is a photo from a process on the future of transport, or how to make transport more equitable, environmentally sustainable, safe. And all of these projects, as I said, they came together as a kind of intersection between our research interest in experimenting with new forms of democracy at the local government level, and I'll get to that, why that is the case, and the interest of local government bodies who wanted to actually have better informed and more inclusive and actually less hostile way to engage with governments, with the citizens, because what they found is that often these town halls were quite unpleasant places for, say, Auckland Transport and Water Care to engage with people. Next slide. So these are the experiments that have taken place over the last 3-4 years, and as you can see, there's been quite a few, and I put in bold those that my colleagues and I have been involved in, and as they were almost all again at the local government level, and we can talk about any of them later. Next slide. Yes. So what are the lessons? So what we found in all of these processes that we have done is that people, given time, support, and kind of respect, are actually prepared to make decisions that are surprisingly radical, that are surprisingly brave and surprisingly smart. That, for example, in the water care case, they were prepared to, they actually decided to go for direct recycled water, which was not a kind of thing that they actually wanted to do before the start, but once they actually identified what matters to them and what they thought it matters to citizens of Auckland, that they wanted source of water that was affordable, that was an environmentally best solution, they went for that. In the congestion charging process, very interestingly, they also, although they were not initially supportive of congestion, or sort of didn't quite know what to think, they decided they were supportive, provided that whatever revenue is collected is actually put into improving public transport and other ways that people can get around in an equitable way. So this was incredibly heartening, actually, to see that people from all walks of life can come together and actually make incredibly decisions that politicians are not brave enough to do. Regarding the impact, this is a kind of really interesting question, because it's good to kind of ask, so what is the impact that we expect? Obviously, people can't make these decisions, they cannot implement them, right? It really depends on whoever is the authoritative body to implement. So, for example, in the case of water care, we had a convening body that was really interested, and they, after the decisions of the people, they actually went and they built a pilot project. But we kind of so there's a few things that I want to say that, it's a little bit too much to ask of a deliberative body to have all of these decisions implemented, because often you will find that bodies of representative democracy also make decisions that don't get implemented for this or that reason. And for example, when you think of the French Climate Convention, President Macron actually promised that he's going to implement any decisions the citizens do. They recommended very brave climate decisions. In the end, they were not implemented, well, not yet, or some of them, due to all kinds of legal constraints. So perhaps that's a kind of unfair criterion to use. But other ways that we can think about the impact is also like, how does this changes people's life or perspectives and relationship towards politics? How does it change their trust in government? Understanding how policy is made, and all of that we have quite positive experience. In terms of scale, I often sort of said that deliberative democracy is very small, and obviously you cannot have thousands of people deliberating together. That's just not feasible. And it is true, but one way of kind of looking at it is, and this is what many theorists working on this have proposed, is if there are many processes like this, then many people actually get a chance to participate, and they start to participate in a kind of deliberative system. So they almost have as much a chance to deliberate as they have to vote. So that's a kind of maybe a way to think about it. And last slide, I just want to kind of just say, and I don't have really a big conclusion for this, is that obviously the opportunities to trial these kinds of processes really depend on the political environment and willingness to, but there's economic environment, and right now is not ideal, and government bodies and other public bodies, and in the end also other NGO and other organizations, because I should say that deliberative processes do not need to be just for policy decisions. They can be also for agenda setting, or just as a kind of voice of citizens expression. That's actually not so great at the moment. And there's also the fact that what we know also from research that we've done on attitudes of politicians towards deliberative democracy is that bigger parties in New Zealand, and this is actually quite common around the world, are generally, because they're, I guess, protective of their power, they're quite strongly still sort of prefer representative democracy, and they don't really want to experiment, or at least not on the kind of national level, while the right-wing party have strong preferences for direct democracy and referenda. And we have this also in New Zealand with ACT Party, their history goes with citizens' initiative referenda, because they don't want elites or experts to kind of meddle in the relationship between the people and the kind of decisions. And so really the space, if there is, like for us, was at this local and regional level, with a kind of hope that this could build up towards a larger scale. Thanks. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Tatjana. Is there any quick question? Or we'll just go straight to, we'll go straight to, I'll go straight to Tanya, and we'll have questions at the end. To Sandra. Sandra?
Kia ora. I made that happen, didn't I, but just by standing up. Look, thank you. I'll do a very short introduction, but I am going to point out I've used Wendy Brown as well, so always the academic, going back to academic sources. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou. Ko Taupiri Te Maunga, ko Waiuku me Waikato Te Awa. Ko Te Hautu Karangi e Mahiana, ko Sandra Grey tōku wingawa. I am the Tupo Ahorai, the National Secretary of the Tertiary Education Union. I hail from a community not too far from here, grew up in Waiuku, hence the reference to the Waikato and Waiuku rivers. I was a political scientist and academic at Te Hiringa Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, for about 10 years. And in that time took leadership roles in the union before becoming a paid official in a trade union, and have colleagues here who campaigned with me when we campaigned to retain MMP, which feels a lifetime ago, doesn't it, Matthew? a much lifetime ago, and no, I am not responsible for some of the people in Parliament just because I believed in MMP. So I take no responsibility for who's there. But I do still take a very active interest in democracy. And before I raise some of the points that I want us all to reflect on, I do want to talk about democracy at an even more local level or intimate level. So those that know me and have been in rooms with me, as I'm a lover of, love good debate, love really good debate, love post-it notes, love getting ideas out on the board, loving working out where the connections are. And two processes recently run with my own union. We ran predominantly through the COVID lockdowns, 166 online forums to debate with our members the principles of becoming the first co-governed union in New Zealand. So we now have a council that is 50% Māori and 50% tangata tiriti. And that process we did through deliberative forums talking about the principles behind what it was to be a union in Aotearoa, not a union anywhere else. And more recently, to the shock of my council, I proposed that we didn't go out to the members with the goals of the union, that we invited the membership to debate what they wanted. And we ran 2 months of surveys, online conversations, local meetings, which culminated in our conference where 150 delegates went into 4 rooms over 2 days and designed 4 goals for the union for the next 4 years. So using those democratic principles, I've always favoured those. But I guess what I want to talk about is why it's near impossible in this current environment to be democratic, no matter where we are. New Zealand, of course, to the rest of the world, is one of the longest standing and freest nations in the world. Freedom House right now gives us a score of 99 out of 100. I'm not sure why we lost the 1, and it could be some of the people that got into Parliament under MMP, I'm not sure. But that score looks at those very conventional ideas of democracy. Can you get to the polls? Can you vote? Do people feel safe to vote? Do we have competing political parties? But there is a lot more to it than that. And if we look under the hood of our current democratic system, there is a significant problem. And hopefully, as I tell my tale, you will get why I think there is a lot of disillusionment and disaffected voters right now, but also that filters into day-to-day life, into their community activities, into their union activities, into the world they live in. So I'm going to start with Wendy Brown as well, who said democracy is where citizens with vastly unequal backgrounds and vastly unequal resources are brought together. So democracy is about bringing people together. It is where citizens are politically enfranchised and where differences in inequality and difference are made manifest, so made obvious to all, but possibly politically resolved. So there's 3 parts that I want to talk through and why I have grave concerns. As a political scientist, as the leader of the trade union movement that I'm part of in the tertiary education sector, a leader in the education sector, because I'm going to say that's a huge part of democracy and is being unpacked as we sit here. So I want to go through those 3 parts. Democracy is supposed to bring us together. It is supposed to make us see what we have in common, make us see what we share. But right now in New Zealand, I would say the driving narratives are creating the us and them narratives everywhere you turn. I am going to lay the blame at the feet of the ACT Party for some of this. And Hobson's Choice and the Free Speech Union and all of them tied together by a same group of actors. Their One New Zealand rhetoric cannot be mistaken for anything other than what it is. It is white supremacy. And we have to label it for what it is. And we have to identify that narrative divides us. And it's highly concerning. So for any of you who, like me, have a very diverse family, I do not want an Aotearoa which divides me as tangata tiriti from my 2 nieces who are tangata Māori. Anyone who tries to separate us has got a fight on their hand, and ACT does from me. So we have a divisive society because of that rhetoric. We also have a whole range of other divisions, and I want to talk about one right now that is dear to my heart because I live in Wellington. Wellington is becoming a ghost town. It is a very depressed economy. It is a very depressed citizenry and society. And that is because this government and members of the public who support them are demonising public servants as cruel, wicked people who should lose their jobs, not as people who are there to serve the public. So we are dividing the world between the real workers of the world, and people often tell me that my members in the Tertiary Education Union aren't real workers either, because they're knowledge economy workers. The real workers, the tradies, my dad, the boat builder, that's the real worker of the world. And my husband, who's a cybersecurity analyst for the Ministry of Education, is not a real worker, and he doesn't do anything that's helpful except keep all of our details that are lodged with the Ministry of Education safe. So you might want to thank them for that, but we don't. We see them as wasteful, as taking our taxpayer money. Frivolous activity, backroom activity that's not needed. And actually the president of our union once said, oh look, let's just talk about it like a supermarket. The public service. We're going to have lots and lots of front-facing checkout operators, but we're not going to have anybody working out in the back in the stores, so there's going to be nothing on the shelves. So why have we got the checkout operators? So there is a real problem that we are dividing the world into knowledge economy workers, public servants, and the real workers of the world, who their hard-earned money is paying the wages. And I'm not denying we have to be careful with public money, but that divisive narrative is out there. And the third one, of course, equally important to me, is right now, I think we have the most savage attacks in 4 decades on unions. So I would say we have ACT International demonising trade unions, demonising workers who unionise, and they are systematically unpacking us. That's the 360,000 workers who are represented by unions in New Zealand are losing their collective voice, bit by bit, some of it in deep chunks. The last one, but I'll come back to social media. In New Zealand, the divisions are being exacerbated by private interests holding far too much control in social media and private interests holding too much control in mainstream media. So that's point one. You need democracy to bring people together. We are being divided by our democratic structures, by our democratic leaders. The second is people must feel politically enfranchised. We are weakening our civil society. Our leaders are weakening our civil society. The social contract between Parliament and citizens is breaking down. And I absolutely agree about there is a fear around expertise. So if you read budgets like I do, you would have noticed in the vote science and technology and the vote education, all of the advisors who were seen as expert subject matter advisors have gone, but political advisors have stayed with this government. So people who have real expertise and knowledge are losing their jobs and being ignored when they do offer advice. But more than that too, I am going to say this government and possibly others before it ignore experience. They don't really want to hear how people's lives are going, the experience of ordinary citizens. But it's not just that they, through urgency, through haste, through derisive comments of the public, and it is parties from both sides of the political spectrum that have done this over the last 4 decades. You can find examples of throwaway comments which are quite harmful, and one that immediately comes to mind is Helen Clark speaking about protesters in ways that said they have no right to be here and they're just rabble. Protesters are citizens with a point to make. You should never call them rabble. So it's not just that we've got a problem now, it's been a building problem. But it has got it's been exacerbated. And actually, one example I want to use is Susie Wiles, and I'm sure you all know who Susie is. Her pink hair stands her out beyond anything else. But more importantly, her expert commentary, the way she spoke during COVID, meant that ordinary citizens could understand very complex science. And the work she did in the cartoons with Toby were amazing. If you don't know already, Susie took a court case against her own employer. The reason being, when Susie got death threats for speaking out about COVID, and I am going to say it was harsher on her, other academics got criticism, but women academics get death threats and rape threats through their work emails from people who disagree with them. Susie went to her employer and said, "What are you going to do about it?" Her employer said this, "Well, Susie, if you just stop speaking publicly, you wouldn't get death threats." So that is an example where expertise is shut down because of a risk-averse institution, the risk-averse institution being universities. Susie won part of her case, but it has a chilling effect on academics, and it's not the only example. More recently, there were savage and toxic attacks on Anne Salmon. Whatever you think of her political stance and her research, having acts, David Seymour say that she was part of a group who had regulatory standards derangement syndrome. And the online harassment and intimidation she received is echoing through the academic community. And experts now self-censor and don't want to speak publicly and don't want to speak their mind, and they don't want to get involved. Not only that, I am going to say the way universities are run, you're not thanked for your public contributions. When I was an academic and did work with non-government organisations, with community and citizens organisations, I was told to stop doing that work and start researching the United States, because there aren't enough scholars doing that for now. So international publications, the demand for commercialisation, which is ramping up, the massive cuts to the humanities and social sciences, if you don't know already, they are losing funding hand over fist. All of those, the desire to tie everything academics do to economic growth, are shutting down the public-facing expertise that we need. The final part of democracy is we come together as diverse peoples with all of our inequalities to actually try and resolve some of those inequalities. This is the sharing of the resources that we have. I probably don't need to tell any of you, because you would inform yourself about this, but in New Zealand we have growing inequality and growing hardship. And I was going to read some stats, but I'm actually just going to tell a story. A colleague of mine recently pulled into a car park in Oriwa, actually. There were 10 people living in cars. Those 10 people were waged workers who could not afford their rent. And if you go online and watch the launch of the Living Wage Resine campaign, one of the workers talks about working for Resine for 13 years. They take home pay a fortnight is $1,700 a fortnight. They live and work in Petone. Their rent is $1,200 a fortnight. This is the type of inequality, the depth of it now in New Zealand. We have a real crisis, and in real human terms. And 20% of the households in New Zealand hold nearly 70% of the net worth of our nation. We are highly unequal. Tax policies favour the rich. Education policies favour the privileged. And I'm going to say that's just got worse by the government's announcement around polytechnics. The communities who are losing polytechnics are Tokoroa, Whangarei, Taupo. Parts of Gisborne campus will go, parts of Taranaki, the West Coast. These are already economically deprived communities. There will be no education there. But it's okay, because Auckland University, Victoria University, Canterbury University will thrive, don't worry. But it is again that idea that the privileged have access to education. We have media dominated by private companies. We are reinforcing every day, or hearing reinforced every day, that the state, and particularly large state, is bad, but private profit and private good is excellent. And these unfair results have an impact on democracy. So why have I outlined those three? Why have I outlined the fact that it should bring us together, democracy? Why have I outlined that we want to get rid of the inequalities, or at least start to lessen the inequalities between different citizens? And why does it matter if we don't have people who feel politically enfranchised, and how do they relate together? Well, there is no doubt that we are seeing a gap between ordinary citizens and those who make decisions. Free speech is winning out over debate. And that's in almost every forum. And free speech is about to be legislated for universities. They will have to have policies on free speech. And this means that anyone can go onto campus and say whatever they like. Universities are a place of academic rigour. They are not venues for hire. And it really upsets me that my colleagues, the members of our union, can now have people come on and spout total untruths about the climate, about Māori, about te tiriti, about gender, about sexuality. We now will have to let them on campus, because if we don't, we'll get reported, and that report will be made public, that we have denied those people space on our campuses. So free speech over public debate. We have a winner-takes-all approach over sharing of resources in New Zealand. The dollar is right, might is right, and people are being forgotten everywhere. We want a small state and privatise wealth and costs over public sharing. All of these affect democracy, and they all have exactly the same source. And that is the structure of capitalism. Free market capitalism kills democracy, and it is doing so in New Zealand. And I don't mean in the way that our elections are bought. I mean in the fact that some people are now always on the bottom of the heap, and that every decision being made by local government, by central government, every decision being made is keeping them on the very bottom, and there are more of them every day. And a democracy cannot operate if we consign people to the scrap heap. It can only thrive when everyone feels enfranchised and everyone feels that they can have their say. So if you want to solve democracy, you've got to solve our economy. And that's even more fiercely defended than representative democracy by political parties, I am going to say, because when you're the head of a trade union, you know how hard people will fight you to keep business ideals at the forefront and democratic ideals, and the people at the bottom of their decisions.
We're on a roll here. This is amazing. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Less accustomed as I am to public speaking. Look, I've got a series of what might seem disconnected points, which I probably won't put as eruditely as those who've spoken before me, but for me, they integrate into what I believe democracy is, the threats to it, and how we might be able to do better. For me, democracy, in the way that I like it, is reliant on a lot of values. Freedom from corruption, the importance of the rule of law, fair sharing of resources, which includes not just the fair sharing of income, but a fair sharing of wealth. Opportunity, hope, for me, that involves social mobility. Freedoms are very, very important. Freedom of expression, I'm not sure I completely agree with you on the freedom of expression point. If you look at what's happening in the moment in America, the right are closing down freedom of expression for people who are criticising what's happening in Gaza. So I personally don't see freedom of expression as a left-right issue. I do, though, agree that there's a difference between shouting at people and having debate, and that social media is part of that, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on that. Other freedoms are important. Freedom of religion, freedom to express your sexuality, freedom of enterprise. I remember years ago reading that book by Amartya Sen, an Indian economist, pointing out that excessive regulation that stops people doing what they want to do is a terrible thing. It's a loss of freedom that effectively entrenches privilege and works against democratic outcomes. The protection of property rights against theft of them by the state or anyone else is important. but that doesn't mean to say that there should be inherited privilege. The excessive protection or definition of private property rights can be taken too far and effectively undermine public rights. You can entrench as a right the right to pollute, which should not be part of a private property right, and you should not have to compensate someone who is forced to stop their greenhouse gas or water pollution, to give but two examples. Industrial democracy is an important ingredient of that sharing of income, opportunity and wealth, and therefore an important part of democracy. Now, how do you get to the sort of democracy that you have within a country that you value and want to defend? Well, actually, sometimes through historical accident. I was always struck by that book written some years ago called Fairness and Freedom by David Hackett Fisher. I found that a really interesting analysis. He's an American who spent a lot of time in New Zealand, and he wrote a book about why it was that New Zealand's values are different to the US values. And he put it down essentially to the period in which the colonisation of our respective countries happened. He said that the predominant fear of people or predominant concern people were leaving the UK to go to America about was actually religious freedom. The Pilgrims left terrible prejudice and lack of freedoms in the Cotswolds and other parts of the US to go on the Mayflower. People followed in the 1600s and 1700s, and at the heart of their colonisation experience was liberty, religious freedom. By the time New Zealand was colonised, those freedoms were already taken for granted, even pretty much in the UK. I'm not saying perfectly, but better than they previously were. And the politic in the UK had moved more towards fairness, which meant that as we were colonised, there was actually, with the experience of what had happened to the Indians in North America and what was happening in India and what was happening in parts of Africa, imperfect though the treatment of the indigenous population in New Zealand, it was actually better than in earlier colonisations. So that flowed through the treaty. So those sorts of values were there. And then what keeps them alive is in part a popularity of those viewpoints and convention. And I'm a great believer in the importance of conventions, and not actually a great believer that written constitutions actually necessarily protect those values. So yes, I do agree that really democracy at its heart is supposed to bring people together, or put another way, is meant to be able to find a peaceful way through disagreements for the common good, which is not to say that you can take that too far and it sort of verges towards fascism as well, because you can have the tyranny of the majority. So there's a balance required in all these things. Nonetheless, I think most people here would agree that around the world, polarisation is on the rise and democracy is diminishing. That's true on the international stage. The international democratic institutions are the weakest that they have been since World War II. The World Trade Organization isn't working. The UN is ineffective. The head of the UN has been declared persona non grata in Israel and can't even visit. There are sanctions being taken out by America against countries or individuals that cooperate with international institutions like the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. Though the international institutions are ineffective at stopping what's happening in the Ukraine or intervening in Africa. This is not a short-term problem, and New Zealand can be prouder than some of our record on those things in recent years. Helen Clark kept us out of Iraq. I think that's been one of the big sort of chunks out of the international rule of law, that there was an international invasion of a country, Iraq, despotic though that regime was. So, what else? We've got drops in voter participation, especially at a local government level. So what's wrong? What else is going wrong? I personally think we've got an intolerance of intolerance. It's one of the reasons I think you've got to be a bit careful that you're not so strident in your own pursuit of, because I'm a liberal, but I don't expect everyone to hold all of my liberal values. And for example, I would prioritise class more than race. And I don't see the treaty as a partnership between races. And I said something about this in my valedictory speech. And I haven't got time to go into that properly, so I don't want to leave it in a way that sounds intolerant. I'm actually completely with Anne Salmond, who's got a similar view. But I do think at the moment, if you're a liberal person, but you don't agree with an aspect of liberalism, some of the people who would see themselves as even more liberal than you are very willing to dump on you as a liberal, and they're even more willing to dump on people who are less liberal. And I think that actually provokes a reaction that we've got to be very, very careful of, because I think an intolerance of intolerance is in itself an intolerance which endangers democracy. I know it's a bit of I probably haven't expressed that very well. So what can we do well? Well, I think we can take pride in our own values and institutions and traditions. I really loved what Paul Keating said recently when the Labor government over in Australia was being too submissive to the new Trump administration. And he said something like, look, we're a better society, not better people. He said we're a better society in Australia than they are in the US. We've got cradle to the grave health and education. We've got a really good savings and retirement savings and superannuation system, much better than ours. They've got a system which has given real wage increases to working people, far, far higher than working people in America have had for decades, and better than we do here. He said they don't shoot their children at school, and when they do find someone that does, or a class of weapons that does, they take the weapons away. And he was making a very forceful point that their society and democracy is better, in his view, than America, and they shouldn't kowtow to the American version. I'll probably be criticised for saying kowtow, but again, if I am, that's an intolerance. Or maybe that's me being not careful enough. I also think that, for me, I hate nationalism, but there are aspects of nationality that are important. And I, for one, am very happy that we have banned foreign buyers of New Zealand homes, because the only person that can afford to buy a house in another country is a 1%er. And that deprives someone in New Zealand of the opportunity to buy that property, or it's the most successful person buying their most beautiful lakeside property, or it's a low-income person or middle-income person buying the only house they can afford, which is very modest in South Auckland or some other part of the country. It's nonetheless their dream, and I just don't like those sorts of things being frustrated. And I think also we've got to be very careful around immigration. I think you can push things too hard. We should be more generous on humanitarian immigration, but the rest of it is meant to be in our economic interests. And you can see a backlash against that when people feel threatened in their own economic position. And it's all very well to say that they ought not to be, because the system should be better so that everyone has opportunity. But you push that too hard at your risks, because it actually can be seen as an undermining of social mobility. If you're on the bottom rung, someone comes in on the rung above you and stops you being able to climb onto that rung, you can see why you might be a bit frustrated. So, what are the answers? Well, I've got to the point where I'm actually interested in having a debate about the voting system, because I wonder whether MMP has run its course in combination with social media, and I think there's a connection. And I'm going to read something out that I said in my valedictory speech. To Shane Jones, I love you, but we don't need more coal. He's a top Te student, #1 in our land. He's a Harvard scholar, and he probably read Hanson's Storms of My Grandchildren, which foreshadowed the furious storms we're starting to see. We are all hostages to MMP. Why else would so much political capital be frittered away on identity politics while others fan culture wars and society polarises? To be clear, MMP drives these behaviours in main parties too. I'm going to just unpick that a little bit. In respect of the minor parties, through social media, you can actually reach a small proportion of the population directly, and you don't have to convince the middle. You don't have to convince the traditional middle media person that provided us with a somewhat balanced view. Some people disagree with that. So MMP in combination with social media allows people to, if you are a minor party, get over the 5% threshold by preaching to intolerance and racking up difference, in my opinion. Is this a problem with MMP too? I think for large parties too. I personally think it is. I was in Helen Clark's government for 6 of the 9 years, and she had a reunion of the 25th anniversary of the 99 election last year, and she said something which struck me. She quoted Jonathan Hunt, who was a very experienced politician, very long-serving, who commented that under the old first the past the post system, when you had a contentious social issue or identity issue that you wanted to progress, and I would note that the Labour Party has been responsible for the advancement of just about all of those issues in the last 100 years or so. It's effectively been the voting weight of Labour Party members that has got those issues across the line. But he made the point that if you're servicing an electorate back then under first past the post, and it was a close election, you had to be careful how you did it. And you were not rewarded for going too hard, which is not to say that you shouldn't stand up for your principles, but you shouldn't unnecessarily provoke a reaction from people who would have a different view by going hard if you didn't have to. There's a lot of nuance in that, because he was a Liberal man, and I'm a Liberal person, and every Liberal issue that has been advanced in New Zealand in the last 23 years, I've voted for. So I've got a voting record here that I hope will stop me being misrepresented. So maybe first past the post gets worse over time. It's what Matthew Hooton has said, and I don't agree with Matthew Hooton on a lot of things, but he does analyse things pretty carefully at times. And it's also what Claire Trevette said at the time she recently resigned as a long-standing person in the gallery. You think about it, under the first past the post, we allowed women to vote, we reserved Maori seats, we set up national parks, we went nuclear free, we taxed large inheritances, we built railways and our electricity system, ACC, universal public health and education, affordable homes, a high standard of living, and had less inequality. I'm not sure our record since MMP is very good in terms of us tackling some of the big issues that need to be tackled, like retirement savings, like a capital gains tax, like, in my opinion, a wealth tax, like some of the problems that we've got on the environmental front. So what would I do different? Well, I look across the ditch, and I have to say, I think Australia is doing much better than us. They've got stronger industrial democracy. I know it's declined. They've got higher rates of home ownership than us now. They've certainly got a higher standard of living. They've got a better standard of infrastructure. They've got a sustainable retirement savings systems. I don't think they do quite as well on race relations as us, but imperfect though our record may be. And I'm interested in whether, and in that recent study that the Helen Clark Foundation funded, we found that in New Zealand we've got higher rates of intolerance and higher rates of bigotry now than Australia. And I think that's probably different than it was 20 years ago. So their society is not fragmenting or polarising as quickly as ours. And I think part of the answer lies that in their House of Representatives, everyone has to have a constituency and meet people, and to get elected, to a certain extent, they have to reach for the middle. And they actually have to debate with people rather than shout at a margin of the people who they can reach through social media, if they want to, in order to get their MMP threshold. So I'm interested in the idea as to whether STV is now more appropriate than MMP. And I've got to say I'm not 100% sure. If we had a system that had presidential powers like they have in America, I would not want to go there, because I think first past the post and anything that approaches it, because STV is closer to first past the post than MMP, would be worse. But at the moment, we seem to have a system which isn't moderated. This increasing power that we have on the edges of politics, which isn't moderated by an upper house, seems to me to be one of the polarising forces in New Zealand. Now, STV can work, as we know. It's quite simple to vote. It's harder to count, but you use machines to do that these days. There are a number of variants of it, as we have with some of the councils and previously district health boards in New Zealand that were STV voting. You vote for a block of candidates, and you get more proportionality there under STV than you would if you just have individual constituencies like they do in Australia for STV at the state level, although they run their upper house on a group seat basis. But I'm personally of the view that the electoral system belongs to the people. I think the people are a bit sick of it at the moment, and I think it would be better if all 120 MPs actually had to serve a constituency. I've probably spoken for too long. Oh no, I was going to say something about social meaning, and it is really important. Again, I had a flick at this. It was my last political project before I left Parliament, and so I'll read you something in a letter I sent to someone recently. And this particular person was interested most in the effects of social media on young people, which I admit are a very big problem. And so I admit they're a very big problem, the problems with young people, so I don't want to diminish that, but I said that without diminishing the importance of this person's leading work, the harms extend beyond young people, and so should the solution. Investment scams, misinformation, defamation, theft of content, live streaming, 51 murders in Christchurch, death threats and foreign interference abound. A senior executive at the ANZ recently complained to me that internet investment scams are now more common than legitimate products, and the platforms don't even reply to their complaints. Worse, they take money for the advertising service they provide to the fraudsters. A recent notable case in New Zealand used deep fakes of our Prime Minister Luxon to defraud a pensioner of $224,000. Much of this harm is perpetrated by anonymous people who can't be held to account. Some is aimed at undermining our democratic way of life and freedoms. Truth, facts and science sit at the heart of democracy and free enterprise. Fascism, dictatorship, uncompetitive markets and cronyism thrive on lies and propaganda. The rise in polarisation and distrust and the parallel decrease in social cohesion is now well documented. Many believe, and I believe this, that this is undermining faith in our democracies and our institutions and threatens civil liberties which rely upon the functioning of democracy and trust in those institutions. Megalomaniacal tax-avoiding tech billionaire owners are greedy and selfish. They won't change their practices until liable for the harms they cause. Indeed, of late, some of the largest providers have reduced their moderation efforts and stepped up their own propaganda. The statutory exclusion of liability for third-party content is the underlying cause. It is unusual, it is wrong, and it should be removed. The genesis of the exclusion of liability was confirmed when ISPs convinced parliaments they should be seen as predominantly being a point-to-point mail service. Like a post office, it was thought they should not be liable for what is in the email. They've morphed into publishers to the point where they now earn most of the advertising revenue formerly earned by the Fourth Estate. Removing this exclusion of liability will not kill the internet. E-commerce, entertainment, and masses of information and copious quantities of point-to-point communication would still flourish. I then go into safe harbours and things. But I think if we dealt to social media as we need to, and when I say dealt to, we actually should just remove their exclusion of liability. I don't think we should regulate them. I think we should leave it to the courts to sort out, maybe create a few safe harbours, which I've spoken about previously. But if we did that together with a bit of a change to the electoral system, I think we've got more of a chance of keeping the sort of democracy that I value.
Well, that was pretty awesome. We've got a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. I'm going to give this microphone to Paul so he can put the microphone in front of the person who's asking the question, and that way we get the audience onto the tape, and we'll use this one for here.
David, look, I had a bit to say leading up to my question, but I pretty well agree 100% with everything you said there, and really my question's around MMP and the damage it's doing to this country. And I'm glad to hear you say a number of the reasons Australia is doing so much better than us, because they can just get on and make a damn decision. We procrastinate, we've got members of parliament that don't have constituents, we've got so much polarisation. Question is, what are the chances of us getting rid of MMP to, say, STV, which would seem a likely alternative? What's the chances and when might it happen, do you think, if ever?
Look, I've got no idea, really, and I don't think it's the whole answer. I do think the bottom-up democratic processes that have already been spoken about tonight are also an important an important part of the solution. And I'm also a little bit hesitant that I might be wrong, but that's always true of anything I've led, and I eventually convince myself.
I do just want to remind you that Australia does have proportional representation in its Senate. So we do have to consider that we don't have two houses. So there is a very different system we're talking about. And actually, if I was to say what New Zealand legislation does not move slow, within 48 hours, a government cancelled pay equity claims. That's not slow. We had a bill put into the House last week on the polytechnics and their future, and on Monday, the National Party announced what would be happening, and the legislation has not been passed. And we were given 5-minute slots to defend the polytechnics. So we are moving so fast, our heads are spinning. So I'm not sure slowness is our problem. There's something else.
Can I strongly endorse that? I mean, every country relies upon conventions, and Trump is trashing those conventions in the US, exceeding what would normally have been thought limits to his executive powers, and passing stuff under urgency is terrible. And one of the changes that we need to have as a country, either by statute or standing order, is that whenever anything is passed under urgency, and it is occasionally necessary, but it should not be overused, and anything that goes through urgency should then have a full select committee process.
Yeah, a couple of little points. So with STV, there would be less tail wagging the dog, wouldn't there?
But you can go too far the other way, and the point that's just been made that there is more proportionality in the upper house in Australia is right. They actually both run a system of STV. It's just that they have individual constituencies rather than groups. And I think that's a debate that's very, very important, because if you only have individual constituencies, you do get closer to first past the post. I'll come back to a stat on that under another question, because I got those stats off the web today.
Next question.
Next question. MMP. So we have an election, and then the successful parties go and form a coalition, and they make their agreements that determine how politics is going to play out for the next 3 years. So there's no regulation, no democratic kind of lens that is over that process. I mean, David Seymour can say, okay, I want this regulatory standards bill to go in that as part of the coalition agreement. Surely, I mean, that's just not even democratic. There is no democracy in the room. So how did this even occur?
And I am going to say, even though I was a spokesperson for campaign from MP, I'm not going to sit here and defend MMP at the moment. It is true that most of the coalition deals are done after the election is completed. It does not have to be that way. Transparency could say that the parties have to declare before the election who they are going to partner with. There is nothing stopping that. It's just our political parties have chosen not to do that. I am also going to say that, and this comes back to the role of the plutocracy or experts, all governments change things when they're in because of evidence, because of demographic change, because of world economic change. So we are never truly in control of a representative parliament. They can and do change direction. And I have a former Labour MP sitting next to me, but I'm going to say this. Who in 1984 thought they were voting a right-wing government into power? So please, it's not an electoral system that creates that. Political parties, once they are in power, are in power. They can be voted out every 3 years, but they have control when they are there. So I think we have to recognise that's the limits of representative democracy. There are conventions like select committees that allow them to test citizen ideas and change their minds. And once upon a time, the public service would have provided free and frank advice. That doesn't happen now because it is political advisors, not expert advisors, who sit in Parliament.
That's right.
Yeah, I think it's important that we not be looking at the past through rose-tinted glasses, because there really were problems with first past the post too. I just have my overall assessment, and I've been around this for a while, is the combination of social media and MMP is doing something very unusual, and I'm not sure that the changes that I promote to social media, which are just the removal of an exclusion of liability, they're not regulation of it. I don't think we should become a censor. I think we should just expose them to legal risk that others would have. I've just got those stats here. In Australia, at the constituency level in the lower house, over the last 5 elections, this stat might be one election out, by the way, 38% of constituencies were decided on the first vote, and 92% were eventually won by the candidate with the most first preferences. So it is closer to first past the post than MMP, definitely. It was a different outcome in the Senate, where the constituencies are grouped.
Maybe I'll just add. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, we'll have examples of, MMP and first past the post and different combinations, but none of them seem to work, right? Like that's the thing, because what we are actually talking about is economic inequality, and this is what Sandra was talking about, deepening economic inequality that needs to be resolved in some other way. Different tax regimes, some kind of redistributive policy, like politics. And the other one is deeply changed information environment that we cannot kind of as a society yet cope with. So I don't know that any particular, I think everything is worth experimenting and changing, because I think that's a kind of beauty also of the democratic regimes, right? We're not sort of beholden to an autocrat who will just keep things, but I think these are not the, it's not the MMP that's the real problem.
Kia ora. Can I ask a question about the deliberative democracy? So we don't have an upper house, and we have all the problem with no checks and balances. How far can deliberative democracy, like you've described, start to fill that gap? And it seems to me, within the whole deliberative democracy process, fine to give citizens the information they come up with, sensible judgments, but the gap is how seriously that's taken.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't have to fully translate into action all the time. Politicians in the end have to balance up a whole lot of things, but to be taken much more seriously and brought into, taken seriously to be converted into action. And when's the Labour Party going to do this, David?
So the question was like, how do we do? I mean, that's the sort of thing. Like, it can be implemented if there's political will. I think there's often a kind of what politicians. So my master's student did a research and interviewed New Zealand politicians on what they thought and what were their fears, and it was, people will come up with a really stupid idea, which has never really happened, actually. It just doesn't happen. And there are, of course, you would expect that there are some checks and balances, and there's some terms of reference within which decisions are made. So there are propositions that there are some kind of city-level experiments of actually having a kind of citizen deliberative body in parallel to the representative body, and then some decisions can be delegated to them. And I think actually delegating some really long-term, multi-generational decisions to people who don't have to think about elections in 3 or 4 years' time is very smart. Because, like this is what we heard from our participants in water care, is they thought about their children and their grandchildren. They didn't think about like in terms of 3 or 4 years. Like Maori, as well as everybody else, they thought about like, what is this going to look like, for my children? So, yeah, I would say climate, absolutely.
I just want to agree on that point around the issue about terms and the problem we have. So I've long said tertiary education should not be a political football. It is. Why is it a political football, and how severe is it? The budgets of universities, polytechnics and wānanga are set yearly. So every year their funding can change, and every 3 years the government can change. But we want universities to be around for the 50-year problems, and they can't be. They can't commit to the 50-year problems because governments won't let them. But I am going to give a warning, and I said to you, I love a good poster note, I love a good deliberative forum, I love good debate, I love reading things to inform myself. But I once had a very a wonderful colleague, and we were talking about consensus decision making, which our union constitution says all decisions, first of all, must be made through consensus if we have to, or vote, but we prefer consensus. And this wonderful member said, that's often what happens in a marae. You debate and debate and debate until you come up with the answer that everyone agrees with. He said, but beware, Sandra, people like you and me, who can spin a good yarn, make a good case, and are very good at debating, will win every time. So don't think that deliberative democracy can be equal, because if someone walks into the room with low levels of literacy, they are going to struggle to do battle with someone like me.
Yeah, no, I do agree, and there are, and this is something that as researchers we are grappling with, like how do you create this equality, because people are not equal, and first people who are not even it's quite difficult for them even to engage, because people with low levels of literacy often will not even want to participate. But I mean, I'd rather say, like, rather than it's not going to work, it's like it's a problem we need to solve. So yeah.
Hi. Following on from that,
I will just respond to one point up here. I was asked for a response on behalf of the Labour Party, which I no longer speak for, of course. But I do think that these community up expressions of or considerations can actually create political space, and they can at times remove. They can carry a consensus and actually make it easier for politicians to do what they might want to do, but might otherwise come with more political cost.
Yeah.
yes, I'd like to hear from you an example of deliberative democracy that has a national impact. I'm thinking of, say, Iceland or Ireland, and can you give us an example of that? Where it's made a significant impact nationally, involving a larger group of people.
Yeah, I mean the Ireland one is obviously. I mean, Ireland carried out a whole series of such, because it was part of their constitutional assembly that was the whole series of national level deliberative fora that were debating various parts of the Irish constitution that were meant to change. And the famous one is the abortion law change that was first deliberated and then put to referendum, which I think it's really a great way, if you're worried about representativeness of a deliberative forum, that actually to understand how people are going to even understand the question. Because as we all know, like when you go to referenda, whether people are informed, how they're going to understand, like Brexit is the famous example. And the other ones, obviously the French Climate Convention, which was Macron, as I mentioned, this was called after the Gilets jaunes, and they put together a whole range of wonderful proposals, and Macron was going to we committed to implementing, and then some were challenged in court, say by Air France, because the Climate Assembly said that they are going to ban all the flights should be banned, and that was challenged, and it has led to some significant decisions in France. We would love to do a national level in New Zealand. We had some conversations. Yes, yeah, yeah.
Yes. And actually, the Irish one was broadcast continuously, streamed.
Yeah.
So even if you didn't,
Yeah.
And the original constituency was 1,000 people, reduced to 200 people.
Yeah.
It was supported very widely by the state. All
Yes.
of those things, because when people hear these ideas firstly, they think it can't be done.
Yeah.
And people will be too illiterate or...
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
In
Yeah,
fact,
I agree.
significant things can happen.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys. So my question relates, I guess, to topics that you guys have all spoken about tonight, and it's really, I suppose, kicked off by Tanya, your statement about the tactics of various parties on the right-hand side of politics, using race as a tactic and as a fuel for the us versus them debate. Do you believe that the race thing is intentional, or is it a convenient use of it to enforce a class construct to further their own private interests? As in, how do I describe it? About, I guess my question is more about proximity to politics and to decisions and to community. And there's a real, you've seen it in overseas, in the States, where local bodies have essentially been, and immediate communities have been depowered by the rise of social media platforms being able to connect intermittent communities and allowing more radical thought and more polarized thought to connect and become a seemingly larger voice than what it actually is within those immediate local communities and empowering those decisions. So across all of you guys, do you believe that, I guess, the race thing is the intentional and that's the point of it, or is it just a convenient way and an easy way for the powers that be and the vested interests to further entrench their privilege and their private?
I would hazard a guess that it is populism, but that might be because I can't understand how anybody can be so cruel. So maybe that's because I'm naive. But I think what I'd say, and this is agreeing about the role of social media, and I'm going to go back to what I said about women academics receiving death and rape threats. I do too as a head of a trade union as a woman. No man would walk up to me in the street and say that. But men of the right feel quite willing to do it from their bedroom, behind closed doors, on my social media. Now, this is because, and moderating students in social media spaces or online deliberative forums or online debates is hard. When people have anonymity, they're much more prepared to be vile than when they walk up to you. I mean, I don't mean, I've had nasty things said to my face, and in fact, Matthew's sitting there, we had people spit at us, throw things at us, threaten us with bodily harm when we were campaigning for MMP. I didn't know people felt quite so deeply about the electoral system until we did the campaign. So it's not that people won't do it, they are less likely to do it, and it's fueled, but also the algorithms of social media drive you further and further into the darkness. So is there anybody here who's a dog lover? Do you ever click on the dog posts on social media? Now is your social media only dog posts? Because that's what's kind of happened to me. I got 2 border collies and started clicking things that were about border collies, and now I can't find any political stuff anymore. That is what social media algorithms are driven to do. And I have a young nephew who told me once he liked Joe Rogan, and now is no longer my nephew because I won't talk. No, that's not true. But young people are driven into darker and darker places by the algorithms of social media. So if we wanted to change something, stop the clever bastards, and it is the right that are much more clever at this than us, flooding so that the algorithms come up with neo-Nazi content 9 clicks from your first right-wing post. 9 clicks down. You get to neo-Nazism. That's what the research shows.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you for a round of applause for a really splendid panel? It's been a really interesting discussion, and of course there's much more that we could go on with it. Can I just make a comment that I'm very chuffed to see a row of top T-shirts in the middle row there. We don't know what all our political colours are in this room, and I've got a feeling we've got a real fruit salad. A real fruit salad, but a fruit salad with a very interesting tinge to it. Maybe tinged with a bit of vinegar, maybe tinged with a bit of sugar. But on the whole, I think we are a colourful group, and we really need to, what is that lovely thing on a conflagration of Mary Campers on one of the TV ads at the moment about no, what's that? Oh, anyway, so can I, yes, stop now, Phil. Can I,
It just goes down.
okay, I'm going to just pass the shovel on to Paul.
Thanks, everyone. Ian, can you stop filming there? Yeah, thanks, mate. Yeah, just very quickly, thank you very much, everybody.